Pillow talks taxes. He has been for over 45 years, and there's not a human on the planet with more experience solving problems on behalf of taxpayers. He wants to solve your problem whether you know you have one or not. So if you do have a tax problem, call us off. If you don't have a tax problem, your current tax problem is taxes themselves. So let's get into the policy issue of today. The big one being the big, beautiful bill, which is to pass the Senate at a vote of 51 to 50. J.D. Vance was called in to break the tiebreaker. I was also told that there was a difference between the House bill and the Senate bill, which means there needs to be some reconciliation.
The bill passed the Senate yesterday. It went back to the House of Representatives today. There are a number of differences in the bill. They expect to iron those out in the next 24 to 48 hours. They still seem to be on track to have this bill on the president's desk by July the 4th. The president has insisted, of course, that he will sign it. There are differences in the bill. There's no question about that. There's some important differences in the bill. There's some insignificant differences in the bill, but the differences have to be ironed out. When it goes to the president, of course, we know that the president doesn't have two different versions of a bill on his desk, one that came out of the House, one that came out of the Senate. So this has got to be a unified proposal, no question about that. And it will be. Whatever comes out of the House of Representatives now will be a unified proposal. And then what has to happen is there's got to be an up or down vote on the bill by each of the houses of Congress, the House and the Senate, so that completed bill is presented to the president. Now, what's going to happen in the House over the next couple of days is they're going to hammer out how they want to deal with the differences. I believe what has happened here, from everything I've seen, is that the Senate leadership has been working with the House leadership so that the Senate would present something to the House of Representatives that the House leadership was confident they could get through their membership. That's where we're at right now procedurally.
What are the biggest differences that affect taxpayers in terms of the Senate version of the bill?
There's a number of them. First of all, the SALT cap. We've been talking about the deduction for state and local taxes for the last 6 months or more. Everybody knows or should know what the SALT deduction is. The deal that came out of the House of Representatives was a $40,000 cap and phased out over 5 years for taxpayers with income more than $500,000. The Senate is going along with the $40,000 cap. They're going along with the $500,000, but they want to have it revert back to $10,000 after 2029. The Senate version is different from the House, even though the numbers are the same, because the House version would be permanent and the Senate version would not. The energy tax credits, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was Biden's big tax bill that passed in 2022 or 2023, 2022 probably. This gave $80 billion of additional funding to the Internal Revenue Service. That set up a number of clean energy credits. Those clean energy credits are phased out quickly under the House bill. The Senate bill does not phase them out as quickly. The Senate bill would give 2 additional years to the phase out of these credits. This is one of the big areas. You and I talked about this in the last couple of podcasts. Various factions, about 4 different factions that were in the Senate that were opposing this thing for one reason or another. And one of those factions was the group of senators that did not want to give up on the energy tax credits. And so this was the compromises. We're going to phase out over a longer period of time. And so that's what came out of the Senate. The other thing that came out is a difference in the way the Senate bill treats the exclusion from income for tips and overtime. The House version eliminates taxes on tips and overtime, but phases out the benefit for high-income taxpayers. The Senate version caps the overtime deduction at $12,500, so only the first $12,500 of overtime pay would not be subject to tax. And then as far as tips are concerned, it caps those at $25,000. So any tip income in excess of $25,000 would still be subject to income taxes.
How does that compare to the historic unanimous 100-0 vote on no taxes on tips that came out of it? What are the two differences between that, which obviously didn't end up doing anything?
Well, of course, you and I talked about this, and we came to the conclusion that no tax on tips, 100-0 vote was completely symbolic. There's not a single Democrat, Joshua, even though that no tax on tips bill passed the Senate by a vote of 100-0, all right? The Big Beautiful Bill Act only passed passed by one vote and was cast by the vice president, not a single Democrat in the United States Senate voted for this bill, even though voting against the bill would mean, if the bill failed, that would mean that there would be an across-the-board tax increase for virtually every single American, and certainly every American below the 80% income level. Those lowest 4 quintiles of income earners would have had a tax increase. This is why I believe the Republicans made a strategic mistake with this thing, packing so much stuff into this bill and giving the Democrats so much fodder to argue about, namely the so-called Medicare cuts. I don't believe the contains any cuts in Medicare. It adjusts how Medicare eligibility is measured going forward. It's doing some work on Medicare fraud, no question about that. But as far as cutting Medicare, it doesn't do that. The Democrats are arguing about cutting Medicare, and this just gives them something to argue about. Of course, the deficit issues in the bill gives them something to argue about. What they should have done strategically, in my opinion, sitting here in Minnesota, not in Washington, D.C., what the Republicans should have done is put forth one bill that addresses the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and nothing more, and put it to Democrat House and Senate members. Do you want to vote for an across-the-board tax increase for every middle-income American? Do you want to do that or don't you? And of course, they would have voted against it, and that would have given the Republicans tremendous leverage in the midterms coming up to say not a single Democrat in the House of Representatives voted to keep your taxes down. And I don't believe they would have. I don't believe a single one would have voted to support the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Last election cycle, when Trump won the election, virtually every Democrat was campaigning, as was Kamala Harris, on the idea of eliminating the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. They continue to pound on this mantra every time a Republican proposes some kind of tax reform. They sell it as tax cuts for the rich. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act had nothing to do with tax breaks for the rich. It had everything to do with tax breaks for middle and lower income citizens. That's just a fact. It's demonstrably false to say it's tax cuts for the rich. So the Republicans strategically could have painted the Democrat, particularly the leftist Democrats, into a corner, but they didn't. Instead, they load all this stuff in there. And now they've given the Democrats something they can argue about in the midterm, not the least of which is the additional deficits that the Congressional Budget Office has talked about that are coming out of this bill. Now, the question is whether it will have this impact on deficits or not. That's the debate back and forth, but it's undeniable that the scoring shows this thing as having substantial negative impact on the deficits. In other words, more deficit. And if that weren't the case, why would they have to raise the debt ceiling by $4 trillion, which is part of this bill as well?
Leave it to Trump to remind us that he was, in fact, a New York Democrat originally by convincing Republicans to vote for the highest debt increase in my lifetime.
Where is this going to end, Josh? I mean, my question, and we had this conversation in my office today, where is this going to end? How do you stop this deficit spending? How do you stop this borrowing? We've got a national debt right now that might be in the range of about $37 trillion. And that's the on-budget debt. That's not the unfunded off-budget debt. Unfunded off-budget debt are the future promises of benefits to people, particularly through Social Security. You, as a 30-year-old man, have a promise of receiving Social Security at some point in the future. That's an unfunded liability that can only be paid through current taxes at the time of your retirement 30 or 40 years from now. Those are unfunded liabilities, but they're real, they're not imaginary, and yet there is no way to fund those things going forward. So something has to happen with this budgeting process. The one Republican senator in the United States Senate that voted against it because of the budgeting issues, the deficits and the spending was Kentucky Senator Rand Paul. And Rand Paul is rock solid in terms of his fiscal responsibility and his grasp of economics. He's one of just a handful of people in Washington that understand the problem we're up against. Incidentally, I worked with his father, Ron Paul, who was a member of the United States Congress. I worked with Ron Paul in the 1990s on tax reform issues. Ron Paul was a great supporter of my proposal for national retail sales tax. He and I worked together on getting that done, so I know his father well. I don't know Rand personally. I know his work. My point is that he was the only one of 100 senators that voted against this thing because of the financial irresponsibility that's built into this bill with this continued ongoing spending and deficits.
I know there's a handful of Republican dissenters. I think Thomas Massey was among them. He's been a solid champion of economic policies that actually make sense. The problem is, in a group of 100 senators, we have two true fiscally conservative people. which is the minimum minority.
What it is, Josh, is a scathing indictment of the economic education of American voters. People do not understand what the Constitution provides for and what it doesn't provide for. People don't understand fundamental economics. People certainly don't understand tax policy. There's no question about that. And they keep voting for people who promise to give them something for nothing. Now, you talked about a handful of dissenters. There were a handful of dissenters, but ultimately, at the end of the day, there were only 3 Republican senators that voted against the bill. Susan Collins of Maine voted against it. Tom Tillis of North Carolina voted against it. And Rand Paul voted against it as well.
Did Thomas Massie vote for it?
As far as I know, he did. The only 3 that I know of that voted against it were Collins of Maine, Tillis of North Carolina, and Paul of Kentucky. Paul did it on solid reasons. Tillis did it because of his concern about the Medicare cuts, and Susan Collins did it, and I can't remember why Susan Collins did it, but she voted against it as well. So anyway, the point is that this is an indictment of the education level of the American voter when it comes to understanding basic fundamental economics, constitutional law, and tax law. Voters just don't have any idea what the responsibilities of the United States Congress are under the Constitution vis-a-vis economics and tax law. They just don't know.
It also doesn't help that they keep serving us these massive omnibus package bills, which you mentioned before that they should have just given us a soft win, like an easy softball with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I argue they should have at least wrapped the tips and overtime into it, but it would be so simple for them to create bills that are on one policy only so that people can read through and vote on principles rather than party.
What you just said is precisely the reason they won't do it. It's simple. It's easy to understand. The electorate can grasp what they're doing, and they don't want that. They want to perpetuate the fraud by creating these 1,000, 1,500, or 2,000 page tax bills. The CARES Act, for example, that was passed in March of 2020 was about 2,500 pages long. Who sits down and reads that?
That's not truly representation. If the common person can't sit down and read what bill is being passed and say whether or not they're for it against it with a reasonable degree of certainty, it's not representation. Tyranny by obfuscation.
There's no doubt about it. Alexander Hamilton made the comment in one of the Federalist Papers when the debate on the Constitution was going on in 1787. He made the point, John, what difference does it make if laws are created and passed by people that we elect, if those laws are so voluminous as to be unable to be read and so complicated as to be unable to be understood? It doesn't matter who writes the laws. It is still a fundamental injustice, and I would argue fundamental legislative fraud for Congress to produce these things that we cannot read, and even if we could read them, we can't understand them. It's just complete nonsense. It's reprehensible, and it's just another illustration of how far out of touch our elected representatives have become from the people.
What other differences are there between the House and the Senate bill?
There's a couple of other important differences, and one of them is the way the House bill treats the new deduction for automobile loan interest. The House bill gives a deduction for any interest on the purchase of an automobile. The Senate is limiting that to new car purchases only. The Senate bill would not allow you to deduct interest on the purchase of a used car, only a new car. The Senate bill and the House bill are different in expensing for business equipment. The House bill will give a 100% deduction, an immediate deduction. The Section 179 deduction in the House bill would go to $2.5 million, and the Senate would push it up higher than that. The qualified business income deduction, this is a very important part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, this is the 20% deduction for small businesses. Under the Senate bill, that would stay at 20%. Under the House bill, it would go to 23%, which is better than 20. So that's what we'd rather see. And that applies to small businesses. This is one of the things that flies in the face of this leftist claim that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is for the rich. This small business income deduction, what they call a qualified business income deduction, is specifically and expressly for small businesses. It fades out for higher income people. The more your income is, the less your deduction is, until the point where it completely phases out for high income people. So this benefits low income taxpayers, low income business taxpayers in general, and particularly low income or medium income small business owners. It's vitally important for those folks. The 23% obviously would be even better. So those are the key things. I mean, there's a whole bunch of them, Josh, but these are the key things that affect Jane and Joe American.
Is there anything else in the bill that we should be worried about?
Yeah, the $4 trillion increase in the debt ceiling. And the Senate bill has a $5 trillion increase in the debt ceiling. These people that run up the debt, and instead of being responsible about stopping the deficit spending, they just give themselves another credit card. What this is fraud, Josh, in that it continues to load additional debt burdens on younger generations.
They basically raise our taxes through an inflation every year, and then they expect us to pay our tax.
It's really quite remarkable how they look at this stuff.
Well, on that note, thanks for watching, taxpayers. And remember, there is no such thing as a hopeless tax case. If you think yours is the exception, get a hold of Dan here. He can help you see the daylight. Dan, tell them where else they can follow along with your taxpayers' rights crusade.
Yeah, absolutely. Follow me at Pillow Talks Taxes. I'm primarily on TikTok, Facebook, True Social, and YouTube. Make sure you subscribe, like, and share these videos, especially with your federal and state representatives. If you have a tax problem, go to my website, TaxHelpOnline.com. Buy a book off my website at any price point. You get a free 15-minute consultation directly with me. So go to TaxHelpOnline.com and set the wheels in motion to get your tax problem solved once and for all.